Imagine waking up in 2026 and picking up a smartphone that feels familiar, yet fundamentally different from anything you've used before. His screen lights up, not with Google logos, ads, or hidden background services, but with a clean, elegant interface that feels fast, respectful, and fully under your control. This is the idea behind the Linux Mint phone. A fully open-source smartphone experience inspired by the philosophy of Linux Mint itself, designed for people who want freedom, privacy, and simplicity without sacrificing modern smartphone features. While Linux Mint has traditionally been known as one of the most user-friendly desktop Linux distributions, the concept of a Linux Mint phone represents a natural evolution of its core values into the mobile world. At a time when many users are becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the direction Android and iOS are heading. For years, Android has dominated the global smartphone market, but that dominance has come with trade-offs. Modern Android devices are deeply tied to Google services, telemetry, background data collection, forced updates, locked bootloaders, and proprietary components that users cannot fully inspect or control. Even when Android is technically open source at its core, most real-world Android phones are anything but open in practice. The Linux Mint phone idea challenges this status quo by asking a simple question. What if a smartphone worked like a Linux desktop, where the user is the owner, not the product? The philosophy behind a Linux Mint phone starts with the same principles that made Linux Mint so popular on PCs. Linux Mint has always focused on stability, ease of use, long-term support, and a traditional desktop workflow that doesn't constantly change just for the sake of change. Translating this philosophy to a smartphone means prioritizing a stable user interface, predictable updates, and a system that doesn't break apps or workflows every year. Instead of chasing flashy redesigns, the Linux Mint phone would aim to feel calm, consistent, and reliable, even after years of use. In daily use, the Linux Mint phone would feel surprisingly familiar to anyone who has used Linux Mint on a desktop. The interface would be clean, minimal, and functional, with an emphasis on clarity rather than visual noise. Instead of an app drawer full of pre-installed bloatware, the phone would ship with a carefully selected set of open-source applications that cover essential needs like calling, messaging, browsing, email, media playback, navigation, and system management. Every pre-installed app would be transparent, auditable, and removable if the user chooses, reinforcing the idea that the phone belongs to you. One of the most important aspects of the Linux Mint phone concept is privacy. In a world where smartphones constantly collect location data, usage patterns, voice input, and behavioral metrics, the Linux Mint phone would take a radically different approach. By default, there would be no background telemetry sent to third-party servers. No hidden analytics, no advertising identifiers, no forced cloud accounts. Users could choose to connect to online services if they want, but nothing would be mandatory. The operating system itself would be designed to function fully offline, with online features added only when explicitly enabled by the user. Security on the Linux Mint phone would also be handled differently from mainstream smartphones. Instead of opaque security patches and unexplained background updates, updates would be transparent, documented, and user-controlled. Much like on Linux Mint desktop, users could see exactly what is being updated, why it's being updated, and what changes it brings. Long-term support would be a core promise, meaning the phone could receive security updates for many years without forcing hardware upgrades. This directly addresses one of the biggest frustrations with Android, where perfectly good hardware often becomes obsolete simply because software support ends. App support is often the biggest concern when people think about switching away from Android, and the Linux Mint phone would need to address this carefully. Rather than relying solely on traditional Android apps, the Linux Mint phone concept envisions a hybrid ecosystem. Native Linux applications, built using frameworks like GTK and Qt, would be first-class citizens. These apps would be lightweight, efficient, and deeply integrated with the system. At the same time, compatibility layers could allow many Android apps to run when needed, without requiring full Google Play services. This would give users access to essential apps while still maintaining control over permissions and background behavior. The app distribution model would also reflect Linux Mint's philosophy. Instead of a single centralized app store controlled by a corporation, the Linux Mint phone would support multiple repositories. Much like desktop Linux, users could install apps from official repositories, community repositories, or even directly from developers. Each source would be clearly labeled, and users would have full visibility into what permissions an app requests and what system resources it uses. This approach not only increases trust but also encourages a healthier open-source app ecosystem. Performance is another area where the Linux Mint phone could shine. Modern smartphones are incredibly powerful, yet much of that power is wasted on background processes, analytics, and unnecessary services. A Linux Mint phone, built with efficiency in mind, could feel faster and more responsive even on modest hardware. By using a lightweight Linux base and avoiding heavy proprietary frameworks, the system could deliver smooth performance, longer battery life, and less heat generation. This efficiency would also make the phone more accessible in regions where high-end hardware is expensive or difficult to obtain. Customization would be a defining feature of the Linux Mint phone experience. Unlike Android skins that offer superficial customization while locking down core behavior, the Linux Mint phone would allow deep system-level customization for users who want it, while still remaining easy to use for beginners. Users could choose different interface layouts, gestures, themes, and workflows without resorting to hacks or rooting. For advanced users, access to the underlying system would open up endless possibilities, from custom scripts to alternative window managers, all without compromising stability. The Linux Mint phone would also appeal strongly to developers and power users. Having a true Linux environment in your pocket means you could run development tools, servers, and command line utilities directly on your phone. Imagine connecting a keyboard and monitor and turning your phone into a portable Linux workstation, capable of coding, compiling, and managing systems on the go. This convergence of mobile and desktop computing has been promised for years, but the Linux Mint phone could finally make it practical and reliable. Hardware support is a critical part of this vision. For the Linux Mint phone to succeed, it would need to run on hardware designed with open-source compatibility in mind. This means open drivers where possible, well-documented components, and unlockable bootloaders by default. While this may limit hardware choices initially, it would ensure a higher quality experience and long-term maintainability. Over time, partnerships with hardware manufacturers who value openness could expand the range of supported devices. From an ethical perspective, the Linux Mint phone represents a shift in how technology relates to its users. Instead of extracting data and locking users into ecosystems, it empowers them with knowledge and choice. This aligns perfectly with the broader open-source movement, which emphasizes collaboration, transparency, and shared progress. In 2026, as concerns about digital surveillance and corporate control continue to grow, this ethical stance could become a major selling point rather than a niche ideal. For everyday users, the Linux Mint phone wouldn't feel like a compromise or an experiment. The goal would be to make it feel polished, stable, and trustworthy, even for people who have never used Linux before. Just as Linux Mint Desktop has often been recommended as the best starting point for newcomers to Linux, the Linux Mint phone would aim to be the most approachable entry point into the world of open-source mobile computing. The idea of replacing Android may sound ambitious, but history shows that dominant platforms can lose relevance when they stop serving users' interests. If Android continues to move toward tighter integration with proprietary services, heavier system requirements, and reduced user control, many people will start looking for alternatives. The Linux Mint phone doesn't need to dominate the market to be successful. Even capturing a small but dedicated user base could have a profound impact, proving that a different model is not only possible but desirable. In practical terms, switching to a Linux Mint phone in 2026 would feel less like abandoning Android and more like reclaiming your digital independence. Your phone would become a personal tool again, not a data collection device. Updates would feel reassuring instead of stressful. Customization would feel empowering instead of restricted. And most importantly, you would know that the software running your most personal device is something you can understand, inspect, and trust. The Linux Mint phone also represents a future where smartphones last longer. With efficient software, long-term support, and modular design principles, users wouldn't need to replace their phones every 2 or 3 years. This has significant environmental benefits, reducing electronic waste and resource consumption. In an era where sustainability is becoming increasingly important, this alone could attract users who care about the broader impact of their technology choices. As we look ahead to 2026, the Linux Mint phone stands as a symbol of what mobile computing could be if it were built around users rather than corporations. It combines the maturity and stability of desktop Linux with the convenience and portability of a smartphone. It challenges the assumption that closed ecosystems are necessary for usability and security. And it invites users to imagine a world where their phone truly belongs to them. Whether or not a Linux Mint phone becomes a mainstream reality, the concept itself is powerful. It reminds us that technology doesn't have to be opaque, restrictive, or exploitative. It can be open, respectful, and empowering. And if enough people demand that kind of future, then a smartphone inspired by Linux Mint might not just be an alternative to Android in 2026, but a catalyst for a broader shift in how we think about personal technology.